Your savings are caught in a fight you weren't invited to. Yesterday, inside the White House, crypto executives sat down with bank lobbyists to break a deadlock that's frozen the Clarity Act in the Senate. Publicly, the meeting was called constructive. But here's the contradiction. Everyone says this is about regulation, while quietly arguing over who gets to keep your money. This matters to you, even if you've never touched crypto, because the core dispute is whether crypto platforms should be allowed to reward customers for holding stablecoins. In plain terms, should your money earn returns outside traditional banks? And whether you're told that choice is innovation or danger depends on who's talking. In the Oval Office, the president framed the stakes bluntly. If we don't do crypto, then China's going to do it. That sounds like geopolitics, but look closer, and this becomes something much more immediate. A question about incentives, control, and where capital is allowed to move. And here's where the story flips. The biggest risk isn't China moving faster. It's what Washington can't agree to say out loud. What's unfolding now didn't start with this meeting, and it doesn't end with this bill. The Clarity Act is just the pressure point. The real issue is a larger pattern that's been building quietly. Money moving faster than the rules designed to control it. Here's what we know for a fact. White House officials met with crypto industry leaders and bank associations to break a Senate stalemate. The main impasse is narrow but explosive. Should crypto exchanges be allowed to offer rewards on stablecoins held on their platforms? That single question has stalled everything because banks argue those rewards could trigger a massive flight of capital, pulling billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions out of traditional deposits. Crypto firms say there's no evidence of that at all. Now, pause on that. If this were just about consumer protection, the fight wouldn't look like this. The president has already voiced support for the bill. Crypto companies are openly asking for regulation, and yet progress stops here. So the real framing isn't crypto versus banks. It's incumbents versus exits. Who controls the default place your money sits? And once you see it that way, the question shifts. If rewards are so dangerous, why is this the line no one will cross? Because what happens next doesn't just reshape crypto. It reshapes leverage across the entire financial system. Here's the claim that changes how this fight looks. This isn't a theoretical risk. It's a competitive threat, and the people inside the room are saying it out loud. One of the central voices in this debate, Coinbase's chief legal officer, put it plainly on camera. The issue isn't just innovation, it's making sure that the US dollar remains the global reserve currency and isn't replaced by a Chinese central bank digital currency. That's not a hypothetical. He called the alternative a disaster for America. Then he tied it to something concrete. Demand. As government debt rises, interest rates matter. Stablecoins, he argued, drive demand for U.S. dollars because they're backed dollar for dollar by short-term instruments, principally U.S. Treasuries. In other words, every stablecoin held is still pulling on the dollar system, not leaving it. Now, notice what's missing. No one in this debate is disputing that stablecoins are backed by dollars. No one is denying they're tied to U.S. Treasuries. The argument skips past that and jumps straight to fear. Capital flight, destabilisation, risk. So ask yourself why the strongest facts are being talked around instead of challenged directly. Because if those facts hold, the threat isn't crypto breaking the system. It's competition exposing where the system is weakest. And that's where the tension starts to accelerate. Once that tension is exposed, the situation escalates fast, because this isn't the first time the financial system has faced an exit it couldn't easily control. Every major disruption follows the same pattern. At first, it's dismissed as niche, then it's labeled dangerous, and finally, it's regulated only after it's already reshaped behavior. Banks are warning that stablecoin rewards could drain deposits at scale. They're talking about capital leaving the system. But here's the quiet shift happening underneath. For decades, holding money in a bank meant safety, convenience, and yield. Now, for the first time, there's a competing place where funds can sit, move instantly, and potentially earn rewards without being lent back out through a fractional system. On camera, the contradiction sharpens. Crypto platforms say stablecoin deposits are backed dollar for dollar. largely in U.S. Treasuries. Banks operate on fractional reserves. One system multiplies risk. The other freezes capital in short-term government debt. And yet the newer system is framed as the destabilizer. This is where the story flips. Something that would have sounded extreme a decade ago is now being normalized. The idea that large pools of money might sit outside banks entirely, not illegally, not secretly, but by design. And once that becomes normal, the next phase arrives whether lawmakers are ready or not. Here's the evidence that makes this harder to ignore. The public arguments and the private ambitions no longer line up. On the same program where banks warned of instability, Coinbase laid out a very different reality. Stablecoin deposits, they said, aren't relent across the economy. They're backed one for one, mainly by U.S. Treasuries. Much more secure, was the phrase used, than a fractional banking system that introduces all sorts of systemic risks. Now, hold that next to what happened immediately after. Coinbase didn't just defend stablecoins, it revealed how far its vision already stretches. Stock trading, prediction markets, derivatives, 24/7 market access, direct deposit, an AI-assisted advisor, and everything exchange. This isn't a side business. It's a parallel financial account forming in real time. Here's the contradiction. Critics say crypto firms want rewards without regulation. At the same time, those firms are openly pushing for federal oversight, clearer rules, and defined jurisdiction between regulators. That's not avoidance, that's preparation. This is the line that permanently shifts the frame. The fight isn't about whether crypto wants to act like a bank. It's about whether banks are ready to compete with something that doesn't need to act like one. And once that realization sets in, pressure starts stacking very quickly. Now watch how quickly this stacks into a mini crisis, because while the Senate argues, the system keeps moving. First, the Clarity Act stays stalled. That means no new rules, no expanded oversight, no clear boundaries. But here's the catch. The current law still stands. Under the Genius Act, stablecoin rewards are already legal. That was said explicitly on air. If clarity fails, rewards don't disappear. They continue without the broader framework regulators say they want. Second, the lobbying pressure spikes. Bank groups warn of capital flight. Crypto firms accuse them of protecting incumbency. One figure lands with a thud. Over $3 trillion sitting parked at the Federal Reserve, not doing anything, according to the crypto side. Money frozen, while alternatives promise movement and yield. Third, expansion accelerates anyway. Coinbase talks openly about becoming a primary financial account. Direct deposit, integrated trading, prediction markets. Always on, always liquid. This isn't waiting for permission. It's being built in parallel. Put those together and the loss of control becomes visible. Regulation lags, capital options multiply, trust fragments, and lawmakers are suddenly trying to steer something that's already picked up speed. So here's the question hanging in the air. If this continues unchecked, who's actually setting the rules? The people writing the laws or the platforms people are already moving their money into? Now bring this down to ground level, because this doesn't land on institutions first. It lands on people. If you're an ordinary saver, this fight decides what options you're allowed to see. Whether your money can earn rewards outside a bank, whether moving it is frictionless or slow, whether choice exists at all or is quietly narrowed for your protection. None of that requires you to believe in crypto. It only requires you to notice fewer alternatives over time. Community banks warn that rural areas could be left behind. Crypto firms counter with a different claim, that these tools let people participate for the first time without needing proximity, paperwork, or legacy infrastructure. On air, the argument wasn't abstract. It was about access, who gets included, who decides the on-ramp, and here's the part most people feel but rarely name. When systems change, the cost shows up before the benefits do. Confusion, mixed messaging, competing narratives. One side says safety, the other says opportunity, and you're expected to choose without clear rules in place. If any of this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because the pressure you feel isn't accidental. It's what happens when systems shift faster than the stories explaining them, and that's the moment where this stops being about crypto and starts being about structure. This is where the outrage fades and the mechanism comes into focus, because systems don't move on belief, they move on incentives. Banks survive on trapped capital, deposits that stay put, move slowly, and can be leveraged. Crypto platforms are built around the opposite logic: capital that moves instantly, earns transparently, and isn't quietly rehypothecated behind the scenes. That difference alone explains most of the conflict you're seeing. Notice the incentive mismatch. Banks warn about instability if money leaves. Crypto argues stability comes from full backing and visibility. Regulators want oversight, but only after deciding who controls the rails. Politicians talk about competitiveness while trying not to anger the most powerful incumbents in the system. Everyone is rational inside their own incentives. That's what makes this dangerous. Here's the unsettling insight. Power doesn't disappear when technology changes. It relocates. Whoever defines where money can sit, how it moves, and who gets rewarded for holding it doesn't just influence markets, they shape behavior, slowly, quietly. That's why this debate feels louder than it should. It's not about one bill. It's about whether the financial system evolves through managed transitions or sudden exits. And once exits exist, leverage shifts permanently, which leads to the most unstable phase of all, the moment before direction is locked in. From here, the trajectory splits. And neither path is clean. One path is control through compromise. The Clarity Act passes with limits on rewards. Banks keep most deposits. Crypto gets recognition, but inside tight guardrails. The system absorbs the shock slowly. Headlines calm down, but underneath, the incentive problem remains unresolved. Capital still wants options. Platforms still build. The pressure just moves off camera. The other path is acceleration through delay. The bill stalls. Genius remains the law. Stablecoin rewards continue. Platforms expand anyway. Direct deposit rolls out. Integrated accounts become normal before regulators finish arguing. By the time rules arrive, behavior has already changed. Not through rebellion, through convenience. Notice what both paths share. Neither puts the system back where it was. There's no rewind. The only question is who moves first and who reacts. And this is where China re-enters the frame, not as a villain, but as a mirror. On air, it was stated plainly. China is already offering a central bank digital currency. They're providing yield. They're signaling readiness to step in if the U.S. hesitates. That doesn't mean takeover. It means leverage. So watch the timing, not the speeches, because the next move isn't theoretical. It's already forming around incentives that don't wait for consensus. Here's the insight that ties the entire story together. This was never a debate about crypto. It was a test of who gets to decide what money is allowed to become. The Clarity Act, the meetings, the warnings about capital flight, the references to China, they all orbit the same gravity. Control over default behavior, where money sleeps, who pays you for holding it, and who benefits when you don't have a choice. The most revealing moment wasn't a threat or a promise. It was the quiet admission that even without new legislation, the system keeps moving. Rewards exist, platforms expand, users adapt, law follows, not the other way around. So when you hear this framed as innovation versus safety, remember what's actually happening. Two systems are colliding. One depends on restriction, the other on exit. And history shows that once exits are visible, they don't disappear. This story doesn't end with a vote. It continues with behavior, with where people move their money next and why. That's the layer most coverage misses. If you want to stay ahead of where this is going, follow for the next breakdown, because the next shift won't be announced. You'll feel it first.